So this is the second part of our discussion of the Cold War from 1945 to 1991. And in this, we're going to start with the decolonization and nation building section of our discussion of the Cold War. After partition in 1947, the independent states of India and Pakistan were strikingly dissimilar. Pakistan defined itself in terms of religion, fell under the control of military leaders, and saw its Bengali-speaking eastern section secede to become the independent nation of Bangladesh in 1971. India, a secular republic with a 90% Hindu population, inherited a larger share of industrial and educational resources and was able to maintain unity despite linguistic heterogeneity. In Southeast Asia, the defeats that the Japanese inflicted on the British, French, and Dutch forces in World War II set an example of an Asian people standing up to European colonizers. In the post-war period, nationalist movements led to the independence of Indonesia, Burma, and the Malay Federation, and the Philippines, all in the 1940s. This is the period that we're thinking about when we think about decolonization. It runs through the 1960s, even into the 70s. The post-war French government was determined to hold on to Algeria, which had a substantial French settlement population, vineyards, and oil and gas fields. An Algerian revolt broke out in 1954, but was pursued with great brutality on both sides, but eventually ended with French withdrawal and Algerian independence in 1962. None of the several wars for independence in sub-Saharan Africa matched the Algerian struggle in scale, but even without war, the new states suffered from a variety of problems, including arbitrarily drawn borders, overdependence on export crops, lack of national road and railroad networks, and overpopulation. Some of the politicians who led the nationalist movements devoted their lives to ridding their homelands of foreign occupation. Two examples are Kwame Nkrumah, the independent leader and later president of Ghana, and Jomo Kenyatta, who negotiated the independence and became the first president of the Republic of Kenya. The African leaders in the sub-Saharan French colonies were reluctant to call for independence because they realized that some of the colonies had bleak economic prospects and because they were aware of the importance of the billions of dollars of French public investment. Nevertheless, the French colonies achieved independence between 1958 and 1960. Decolonization in Africa often involved struggles as people of European descent fought against indigenous Africans in an attempt to retain their personal privileges, control of resources, and political power. Race conflict was particularly severe in the southern part of Africa, including the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique, the British colony of Southern Rhodesia or Zimbabwe, and in South and Southwest Africa. In Latin America, independence from European rule was achieved earlier, but American and European economic domination increased. In Mexico, the revolutionary rhetoric of the ruling Institutional Revolutionary Party was accompanied by a large and persistent disparity between the rich and the poor, the urban and the rural. In Guatemala, President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman's attempt to expropriate the property of large landowners, including the United Fruit Company, prompted the United States Central Intelligence Agency to assist in a military coup that removed Arbenz from power and condemned Guatemala to decades of political instability and violence. In the 1950s, the Cuban leader Fulgencio Batista presided over a corrupt, repressive regime while the United States and a small class of wealthy Cubans dominated the economy. In 1959, Fidel Castro led a popular revolution that forced Batista to leave the country and redistributed land, lowered urban rents, raised wages, and seized the property of U.S. and Cuban corporations. There's little evidence that Castro undertook his revolution to install a communist government, but faced with a U.S. blockade, he did eventually turn to the Soviet Union for economic aid and thereby committed his nation to economic stagnation and dependence on the Soviet Union. In April 1961, some 1,500 Cuban exiles, whom the CIA had trained, landed at the Bay of Pigs in Cuba in an effort to overthrow Castro, but the attempt failed, partly because the United States did not supply all the air support that the plan had called for. So decolonization occurred on a vast scale and led to the establishment of dozens of new nations between 1945 and 1965. Each of these new nations had to establish some form of government, and most of them had to do so while facing severe economic challenges. The new nations also had to address serious educational concerns, including questions such as which language to teach, how to inculcate a sense of national unity in places where it had not previously existed, and how to provide satisfying jobs for graduates. The new nations were rarely able to surmount these hurdles, and many nations, even those successful as South Korea, opted for authoritarian rule. And now we'll move to a discussion of the ending period of the Cold War as the world moved away from bipolarity, that is, moved away from dominance by Soviet and American points of view and alliances. In 1955, Indonesia's President Sukarno hosted a meeting of 29 African and Asian countries at Bandung in Indonesia. This meeting marked the beginning of an effort by the many new, poor, mostly non-European nations emerging from colonialism to gain more weight in the world by banding together in what became known as the non-aligned movement, or the Third World. Leaders of the so-called Third World countries preferred the label non-aligned, but as the movement had the sympathy of the Soviet Union and included communist countries such as China and Yugoslavia, the West did not take the term non-aligned seriously. For the movement's leaders, non-alignment was primarily a way of extracting money and support from one or both of the superpowers. One example is the ability of the Egyptian leaders Nasser and Sadat to play the two superpowers against each other in order to get assistance in hydroelectric projects, arms, and loans from both sides. Both Japan and China were able to take advantage of the superpowers' preoccupation with the Cold War. The American occupation from 1945 to 1952 gave Japan a constitution that allowed the country only a limited set of self-defense forces and banned the deployment of Japanese troops abroad. The Japanese stayed out of the Cold War and concentrated on building up their industries and engaging in world commerce, gradually developing new markets in Southeast Asia. The Japanese government aided Japanese business in developing three industries that were crucial to Japan's emergence as an economic superpower after 1975. These industries were electricity, steel, and shipbuilding. China was deeply involved in Cold War politics, being allied to and receiving aid from the Soviet Union in the 1950s. The People's Republic of China, or PRC, and the Soviet Union, or USSR, began to diverge in 1956, and Mao Zedong, the leader of China, introduced his own radical policies with the disastrous Great Leap Forward in 1958, and with the Cultural Revolution, which was begun in 1966. The rift between the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union opened so wide that President Nixon from the United States was able to establish a cooperative relationship between the United States and China in the early 1970s. As the Arab states slowly gained independence in the post-war years, the struggle with Israel came to overshadow all Arab politics. After World War II, intense pressure to resettle European Jewish refugees forced Britain to turn the Palestinian question over to the United Nations General Assembly. The United Nations voted in November 1947 to partition Palestine into two states, one Jewish and one Arab. Israel declared its independence in May of 1948 and defeated the Palestinian and other Arab forces that attempted to crush the newborn state very soon thereafter. In a six-day war in 1967, Israel took Arab lands including East Jerusalem, the West Bank, the Golan Heights, the Gaza Strip, and the Sinai Peninsula. The Palestine Liberation Organization, headed by Yasser Arafat, waged guerrilla war against Israel and engaged in acts of terrorism. The growing demand for oil in the post-war era prompted the oil-producing Arab states to form the Organization of Oil Exporting Countries, OPEC, in 1960. OPEC embargoed the United States and the Netherlands for their support of Israel during the Arab-Israeli War of 1972 and quadrupled oil prices in 1974. The photos you see are the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948 right here, and an image of the Six-Day War down here on the right. The Cold War and the tremendous post-war economic recovery focused public and government attention on technological innovation and enormous industrial projects. Only a few people, such as Rachel Carson, warned that technologies and industrial growth were rapidly degrading the environment. The student protests of the late 1960s in the United States, France, Japan, and Mexico indicated a rising current of youth activism that forced attention on environmental problems. Well, that's our discussion of the Cold War from 1945 to 1990.